So far, we've been working with our example collection of articles. In the last video, we took a look at some of the default endpoints that Strapi creates for us to retrieve, create, modify, or delete entries in our collection. But we don't want just anybody to be able to access and modify all of the content that we're creating. We need some way of distinguishing who is who and who should have access to what types of data. In this video, we're going to check out the Strapi Roles and Permissions plugin, and that's going to handle all of the authentication for our application, as well as controlling access based on that authentication to what kinds of data each person can access. Let's head on over to our Strapi dashboard and take a closer look. I'm here on localhost 1337/admin at our Strapi admin dashboard. And to start to illustrate this idea of roles and permissions in Strapi, I'd like to go ahead and let's try out one of the endpoints that we covered in the last video. So if I open up a new tab here, I'm going to go ahead and paste this that I had copied. And you remember from the documentation we went over that for every collection type that we create, Strapi is going to produce a set of endpoints for us to make queries to, which will give us access to that content. So since we created the article content type, that's going to give us the /articles endpoint, which will allow us to query for the entire list of all of our articles. Just as a reminder, we could also then go / and then the Strapi ID of an article, and that's just a random number, but whatever the Strapi ID of an article is, and then that would get us just a single article. Okay, but we don't know the Strapi ID of our article off the top of our heads, so let's just go ahead and make a request for /articles on localhost port 1337. So I'm going to go ahead and make that request. And it looks like I've got back status 403 forbidden. So that means we don't have access to the route, that endpoint that we are trying to request. The reason that we're seeing this is because as a security consideration, all routes in Strapi are by default inaccessible. So by default, you cannot just access the endpoints that Strapi creates. This really makes sense because it would be pretty prone to error if you were just relying on people to have to go in and remember for every collection type to turn off all the different routes and permissions that you don't want accessible to people. So to make that much more secure, they by default turn everything off, and you have to explicitly turn on permissions for the content that you want people to have access to. Okay, so that's a really nice security consideration, but it's also something you may forget at first. So that's why I needed to show you this 403 forbidden message. If you're seeing this, that means you forgot to go and turn on the permissions for the route you're trying to access. So let's take a look at how we're going to do that. Let's go ahead and flip back over to the Strapi dashboard, and under the left side where we see plugins, let's go ahead and click on Roles and Permissions. We'll get into some of the advanced settings and email templates later, and providers we're also going to be getting into, but not right now. This is actually how you set up authentication through third-party services by social media accounts. But we'll get into that. For now, we just want to stick to the roles and permissions. We'll also go over the actual process for creating and signing up our users and how all that is going to work, and also the conceptual security considerations behind the approach for authentication within Strapi. But we'll go over all of that later when we're actually building the authentication workflow. For now, the first building block of understanding that entire process is just understanding roles and permissions. You can see here that by default, Strapi gives us two roles: the authenticated role given to our users and the public role given to anybody else who is not an authenticated user. Again, we'll get into the exact details of what is an authenticated user and how we're going to set that up and know that later on. But for now, you can basically just know that if you're authenticated, you're going to send a piece of information along with every request that you make that's going to let Strapi know that you're an authenticated user. So if your requests do not have that piece of information, then they're assumed to be the public role. Now, you can also go ahead and here on the right, you see that you can add a new role. So let's go ahead and click on that. And you can see here that it gives you the ability to name the role. So say for our articles, maybe we want an editor. And then you could over here search for the user to automatically associate with this role, but we don't have any users set up yet, so we don't have anything for that. And then we could give it a description, editors of articles. And now here in the permissions, this now controls what content and what functionality this role has access to. The first section of permissions is the application section. And this is all of the actions for the content that we define within our Strapi project. So far, that's just been the article. Under article, you see each of the functions that are possible for that content type. And by checking it, we give the editor role that we're creating permission to execute it. So if we want our editor to be able to count our number of articles, we can go ahead and just like that. You can see that it also shows the route that is bound to that action. So by selecting the count box, this will now give the editor role access to the GET request at /articles/count. And then that will successfully return how many articles we have. Okay? And you can go ahead and select all of these and you see it updates accordingly. You can see here it also says allow to perform this action for, and this allows you to select the policies that you want applied to this route. Okay, and we're actually going to get into policies in the next two videos, but here you can see is authenticated. Make sure that a signed in user is accessing that route. It doesn't specify which sign in user, but just that a signed authenticated user is making that request. Or rate limit says that you can't make more than 5 requests to that route within 1 minute, or else it'll lock you out and you'll have to wait 1 minute and retry. Okay, so we'll get more into those, but essentially that's just extra logic that you can add onto the route to control its access. Okay, underneath the application defined actions, we then have all of the actions for the different plugins within Strapi. Okay, and we haven't gone over plugins a ton, but we are getting into it now with the roles and permissions plugin, our first one, although we kind of worked implicitly with the content types builder plugin, which actually let us put together our article field. Okay, we'll go back over here and I'll open this back up, and you can see if we open up Content Manager, we have all the available actions here. Most of these are only going to be really necessary in pretty advanced use cases. We're not going to get too into most of these. You may get into some of the email stuff. So you could allow or disallow users to send emails. The upload plugin is for uploading our different media, which we'll get into later. And the one that you'll actually probably use the most is the users permissions plugin down here. So this is all the different actions and permissions for actually handling users in your application. All the roles and permissions, the users and permissions, all of the functionality for authentication, users and roles and permissions are going to be within here, this last box in the roles. Okay, and then you could go here, say if we want to know how many users we have, now we can /users/count. Okay, so hopefully this concept is pretty clear. Let's go back and let's open up our public role. Okay, actually we've got to hit edit over there. And now we're editing our public role. So the access that anybody making a request to our application will have. Now, I don't think we want just anybody to be able to create, delete, or update articles, but I think we would want our regular users to be able to know how many articles we have, be able to look at a list of articles, and to be able to read an article itself. So let's go ahead and select the check mark for all three of those actions on our public role, and let's go ahead and hit save. Okay, and once that's saved and you're returned back to this screen, let's go back over to our localhost port 1337/articles and let's refresh this request. And you can already see that instead of the 403 forbidden error, we actually got back the article that we had created, the title of Udemy's best new courses, the content with our actual list, the updated at, created at, the username, the first name, last name. And remember how we didn't have a user set up to actually associate this with? It looks like that just went ahead and associated it with the admin user of Strapi itself. So that's where the first name and last name there are coming from. But you can see that now we actually do have access to the route, and we could now use this information within our application and render the data to the screen however appropriately. Now that we know how to actually control who can access our data and what routes they can access the data from, let's take a look at a little bit more of what's happening when we actually access these routes. Like, how does it know how to find all of our articles? Let's get into that in the next one.